The night air was heavy, weighed down by the weight of whispers from the crowd gathered in my father's grand hall. My cheeks burned as I stood by the arched doorway, my mother's voice echoing in my mind, "Io, you are a disgrace to this family." I stared at the marble floors beneath my feet, polished so perfectly that my own reflection stared back at me. My glittering gown, custom-made for my 26th birthday, felt less like a celebration and more like a prison. The humiliation was fresh and sharp, like a wound left open to the elements. Moments before the toast, my fiancé Dio had leaned in close and whispered words that sliced deeper than I thought possible. "You're too stubborn to be a wife, Io. My family would never approve." He left me standing there, a drink in one hand, a forced smile on my face. Everyone around us carried on, unaware of the quiet storm raging within me. I had spent years trying to meet my parents' impossible standards, obedient, graceful, and perfectly molded to fit their vision of tradition. But it was never enough. Later that night, I sat by my bedroom window in our towering city mansion. The glittering skyline sprawled before me like a promise I didn't believe in. Cars honked far below, their lights dancing along the streets. My room, filled with every luxury one could dream of, imported furniture, hand-woven rugs, and silk drapes, felt like a cage. The city had become suffocating. Its noise, its endless demands, its expectations, I needed to escape. I wasn't just Chief Aid's daughter. I was Io, and I wanted a life where I could decide who that was. By morning, I had packed a simple bag. The designer dresses and polished heels stayed behind. I stuffed in plain clothes, a pair of sandals, and a journal. My destination was a village called Ilera, a quiet place I'd once seen in a magazine spread. It wasn't far enough to make my family panic, but distant enough to give me the fresh start I craved. The bus ride out of the city was long and bumpy, with the landscape changing from gleaming skyscrapers to rolling green hills and dusty roads. I didn't look back as the city disappeared. My heart was heavy with fear, but light with hope. I didn't know what awaited me in Ilera, but I knew my life was about to change forever. The bus screeched to a halt, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Ilera was a far cry from the polished streets of Lagos. The air smelled earthy, tinged with the scent of wildflowers and cooking fires. The village sprawled ahead of me, a collection of mud brick houses with thatched roofs, narrow paths winding between them. Chickens wandered freely, and children laughed as they chased each other with sticks. I stepped off the bus, clutching my worn duffel bag, and stared at my new reality. Ilera was beautiful in its simplicity, but it was foreign. A world I wasn't sure I could belong to. My arrival didn't go unnoticed. Villagers paused their tasks to glance my way, some offering curious stares while others whispered behind cupped hands. My outfit, simple by city standards, seemed out of place here. A woman with a wide smile and a baby tied to her back approached. "You're new here," she said, her tone more curious than judgmental. "What brings you to Ilera?" I hesitated, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. "I just needed a change," I replied carefully. She nodded as if she understood more than I'd said and directed me to Mama Bisi's shop, the heart of the village where I could find out about lodging and work. With a deep breath, I walked down the dusty road, each step taking me further from the life I'd left behind. Mama Bisi's shop was a lively hub. Villagers crowded inside, bargaining for yams, pepper, and smoked fish. Behind the counter stood Mama Bisi herself, a robust woman with a loud laugh and an air of authority. When I introduced myself, she gave me a once-over and said, "We could use an extra hand here. Do you know how to sell in stock?" I nodded, eager to prove myself. As I left the shop with a promise to start work the next day, I noticed a tall man in the corner. He leaned against a post, watching the scene quietly, his dark eyes piercing. I would later learn his name, Tunde. Adjusting to life in Ilera wasn't easy. The mornings began early, with the crowing of roosters and the chatter of women fetching water. By the time I arrived at Mama Bisi's shop on my first day, the village was already alive with activity. Mama Bisi wasted no time teaching me the ropes. "Count properly," she said firmly, "or the customers will cheat you without mercy." Her sharpness was balanced by her warmth, and I found myself laughing at her jokes by the end of the day. The villagers were kind, but cautious. Many came to the shop out of curiosity, asking questions about my past. "Where's your family?" one woman asked, cradling a basket of vegetables. Didn't they want you in the city? I deflected with vague answers, unwilling to reveal the truth. I was here to be Io, just Io, without the weight of my family's name or expectations. One afternoon, as I restocked the shelves, a quiet tension filled the room. Tunde had entered the shop. His presence seemed to command attention, though he didn't seek it. Dressed simply in a faded shirt and trousers, he exuded a quiet strength. Mama BC greeted him warmly, handing him a parcel of grain without waiting for payment. "You're helping with the elders' farm again?" she asked. Tunde nodded and turned to leave, but not before our eyes met briefly. There was no smile, no words exchanged, just a flicker of something I couldn't name. Later that evening, I returned to the small room I had rented from an elderly widow named Mama Eka. It was modest, a single bed, a wooden table, and a window overlooking the village. I lit the kerosene lamp and sat down, writing in my journal about the day. My hands were sore, my feet ached, but for the first time in a long time, my mind was at peace. I had traded luxury for simplicity, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt a quiet sense of purpose blooming. The smell of roasted maize filled the air as I made my way to the market square. It was my first market day in Ilera, and the entire village seemed to have gathered for the occasion. Stalls lined the narrow paths, bursting with vibrant displays of fresh produce, woven baskets, and colorful fabrics. The chatter of bargaining voices mingled with the rhythmic drumming of local musicians. This was a side of life I had never experienced, and I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement as I soaked it all in. Mama BC had sent me to buy more palm oil for the shop, and I navigated through the bustling crowd, clutching a woven basket. Villagers greeted me with warm smiles, some addressing me as Mama BC's new girl, while others asked if I was settling in well. The kindness of their words reassured me, even as the occasional stares reminded me that I was still an outsider. At one of the stalls, I found a group of women grinding spices with stone mortars. Their laughter rang out as they shared stories and teased one another. One of them noticed me watching and called out, "Io, come and join us." I hesitated, then stepped closer, unsure of what to expect. They handed me a mortar, and I awkwardly began pounding the spices. My clumsy attempts sent bursts of laughter through the group, but it wasn't unkind. For the first time since I arrived in Ilera, I felt like I was becoming part of something larger than myself. That evening, the villagers gathered under the baobab tree for storytelling. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, as elders took turns recounting folktales and legends. I sat among the crowd, mesmerized by the richness of the stories and the way they connected generations. To my surprise, Tunde was there, sitting a few feet away. His quiet presence stood out even in the lively atmosphere. When one of the elders began a tale about resilience and love, I caught Tunde glancing my way. I quickly looked away, my heart inexplicably racing. The evening ended with songs and laughter, but as I walked home, Tunde's gaze lingered in my mind, leaving me with questions I couldn't yet answer. The sun rose over Ilera, bathing the village in a warm, golden light. Life here followed a rhythm I was beginning to appreciate. Early mornings, hard work, and evenings filled with quiet reflection. At Mama BC's shop, I had settled into a steady routine, but today promised something different. The young apprentice who normally delivered goods to the elders was sick, and Mama BC turned to me. "Io," she said, hands on her wide hips, "you'll take the supplies to the elders' farm today." The farm was on the edge of the village, nestled near a stretch of lush green hills. Mama BC packed a sack of grain, dried fish, and other essentials for the elders. "Tunde will meet you there," she added casually. My heart skipped a beat at his name. I had seen him often enough to recognize his quiet demeanor, but we hadn't exchanged more than a few words. Still, I nodded, determined to make myself useful. Balancing the sack on my head like the other women in the village had taught me, I made my way to the farm. The walk was long and dusty, and by the time I arrived, my neck and shoulders ached. The elders' compound was simple but welcoming, surrounded by rows of crops swaying in the breeze. Tunde was already there, crouched in the dirt and inspecting a row of cassava plants. He glanced up as I approached, his gaze steady but unreadable. "You made it," he said, standing and taking the sack from me with ease. His voice was low and calm, and I noticed the strength in his hands as he lifted the heavy load. Thank you, I said, slightly out of breath. He nodded and gestured toward the crops. The elders could use an extra hand. Can you help me with the weeding? His tone wasn't exactly warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. I agreed, kneeling beside him and mimicking his movements as we worked the soil. For the next hour, we worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional instruction from Tunde. Pull from the root, he said once, demonstrating with a firm but gentle tug. I tried to match his ease, though my hands fumbled at first. By the time we finished, my arms were sore, but a sense of accomplishment filled me. As we gathered under the shade of a tree to rest, Tunde surprised me by speaking first. You're not like the others, he said, his tone thoughtful. You work hard, even though I can tell you're not used to this life. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a flicker of defensiveness. Maybe I'm trying to learn, I replied, meeting his gaze. For a moment, his expression softened, and I thought I saw a hint of a smile. That's good, he said simply. As I walked back to the village that afternoon, the memory of that small exchange lingered. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The days in Ilera began to blur into a routine I had grown to enjoy. Working at Mama Bisi's shop, walking through the village, and learning the customs had become second nature. But shadows from the life I left behind crept into my thoughts, often at night when the world was quiet. I would lie awake, staring at the wooden beams of my modest room, wondering how long I could keep this charade. The letters started arriving shortly after my third week in the village, crisp, white envelopes with my father's bold handwriting, delivered by a traveling trader. The first letter had been curt. Ayo, enough of this rebellion. Come home. Your place is with us. The second, more pleading. You've made your point. We miss you, but your absence is bringing shame to the family. I hadn't responded to any of them, though I read them over and over, guilt pooling in my stomach. It wasn't that I didn't love my family. I did. But I couldn't return to a life where I felt like a puppet. Not yet. I wasn't the only one haunted by the past. Tunde, for all his quiet strength, carried a sadness I couldn't ignore. The villagers often spoke of him in hushed tones. He's never been the same since his wife passed. Mama Bisi told me one evening as we closed up the shop. She was his whole world, and losing her, it broke something in him. I nodded, pretending her words didn't affect me. But later, as I sat by the window of my room, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he worked tirelessly, the way he avoided crowds, the way his eyes carried a weight I couldn't yet understand. Our interactions grew more frequent. He would stop by the shop for supplies, and I found myself looking forward to those brief exchanges. One afternoon, while I was stacking jars of palm oil, he lingered longer than usual. You're settling in well, he said, his tone measured but not unkind. I glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. I'm trying, I said, offering a small smile. He nodded, and for a moment it seemed like he wanted to say more, but the words never came. As the days turned into weeks, I realized we were alike in ways that surprised me. Both of us were running from something, hiding pieces of ourselves we weren't ready to share. But while I had come to Ilera searching for freedom, Tunde seemed to be searching for peace. In the quiet moments when our paths crossed, I began to wonder if we could find what we were looking for, not alone, but together. The rains came unexpectedly that afternoon, turning the dusty streets of Ilera into slick red mud. I had just finished delivering a basket of goods to one of the elders when the downpour began. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I sprinted toward the nearest shelter, a small wooden hut near the outskirts of the village. The rain soaked through my dress and my sandals slid in the mud, but I managed to make it inside, dripping and breathless. To my surprise, Tunde was already there, leaning against the far wall with a bundle of firewood at his feet. He looked up as I entered, his expression unwritable. You got caught too, he said simply, gesturing toward the rain. I nodded, wringing water from my sleeves. The space was small, forcing us to stand closer than usual, and the air between us felt charged, though neither of us spoke. The rain fell in heavy sheets, pounding against the thatched roof. I watched as Tunde pulled a small cloth from his pocket and began drying his hands. You shouldn't be out in this weather, he said after a moment, his tone carrying a hint of concern. It came out of nowhere, I replied, shivering slightly. He reached into the sack at his feet and handed me a folded piece of cloth. "Here," he said, avoiding my gaze. "It's not much, but it'll help." I took it hesitantly, touched by the small gesture. "Thank you," I said softly, wrapping it around my shoulders. We stood in silence for a while, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain. Finally, I found the courage to speak. "Do you ever feel like you're trying to escape something?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he turned to me, his dark eyes meeting mine. "Every day," he said quietly, "but some things follow you, no matter how far you go." His words struck a chord in me, and before I could stop myself, I said, "I came here to escape too." He didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any, but the unspoken understanding between us was enough. For the first time since I arrived in Ilera, I felt seen. Not as the runaway daughter of a wealthy family, but as a person carrying her own burdens. The rain eventually slowed to a drizzle, and we stepped outside, parting ways with little more than a nod. But as I walked back to my room, the warmth of his kindness lingered, and I realized something had shifted between us. A quiet connection. Fragile but real. The rains returned a week later, heavier this time. The morning sky had been a calm gray, but by midday, dark clouds rolled in, and a steady drizzle turned into a relentless downpour. I was helping Mama BC organize the shop when the storm began in earnest. "Close up early," she said, waving me off. "No one will be out in this weather, and you don't want to be caught like last time." I grabbed my shawl and started the long walk back to my rented room. The rain stung my skin as the wind whipped through the narrow streets. The muddy path made each step a struggle, and soon my sandals were caked with red earth. By the time I reached the edge of the village, I was soaked through, shivering and desperate for shelter. That's when I saw Tunde, standing under a large tree, holding a struggling goat on a rope leash. "You again?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Do you always get caught in the rain, or is it just when I'm around?" he teased, his rare smile flashing briefly. I joined him under the tree, grateful for the slight reprieve. "You're one to talk," I shot back, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. "What are you doing with a goat in this weather?" "She escaped," he explained, his voice steady but laced with exasperation. "I didn't want her wandering off in the storm." As if to prove his point, the goat bleated loudly, pulling at the rope. I couldn't help but laugh again, and Tunde's smile softened into something quieter, more genuine. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the tree offered little protection. "Come on," Tunde said, jerking his head toward the small shed nearby. "It's better than standing here." We hurried inside, the goat in tow, and closed the flimsy wooden door against the wind. The space was cramped, with stacks of firewood piled in one corner and farming tools scattered around. I sat on an overturned bucket while Tunde tied the goat securely to a post. For a while, we simply listened to the storm. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and damp wood. My shawl was soaked, and I began to shiver despite myself. Tunde noticed and, without a word, shrugged off his jacket, draping it over my shoulders. "You'll get cold," I protested, but he shook his head. "I'll be fine." Something about the intimacy of the moment, his quiet generosity, the closeness of the space, made my heart ache in a way I didn't fully understand. "Thank you," I murmured, pulling the jacket tighter around me. He nodded, his gaze distant. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said suddenly, his voice low. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Her?" I asked cautiously. He hesitated, then sighed. "My wife," he said, his tone careful, as though testing the weight of the words. "She was strong-willed too, stubborn, but kind." There was a sadness in his eyes that made my chest tighten. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he interrupted, managing a small, wistful smile. "It's been years now, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday." His vulnerability caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. Finally, I reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "For what it's worth, you seem like someone she'd be proud of." Tunde's eyes met mine, and the space between us seemed to shrink. The storm raged outside, but inside that tiny shed, the world felt quiet and still. Neither of us moved, but the moment stretched, charged with something unspoken. Then, as if remembering himself, Tunde pulled away, breaking the spell. "The rain's letting up," he said, standing abruptly. "We should get going." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. As we stepped out into the drizzle, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between us. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something fragile and new. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. The morning was crisp and cool, with the scent of rain lingering in the air from the previous night's storm. I was arranging tins of milk and jars of palm oil at Mama Bisi's shop when a familiar voice startled me. "Ayo," the voice called firmly. I turned, my heart stopping, as I saw my elder brother, Femi, standing at the shop's entrance. He was dressed sharply, his suit looking out of place in the rustic surroundings of Ilera. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his frustration. "What are you doing here?" I asked, setting down a tin with trembling hands. My voice was calm, but my mind raced. How had he found me? Femi stepped closer, glancing around the shop. "I could ask you the same question," he said coolly. "Do you have any idea what you've done to the family? Father's furious, and Mother's been worried sick. We've given you time, Ayo, but this is enough. You need to come home." I felt the weight of his words settle on my chest, and I glanced at Mama Bisi, who had retreated to the back of the shop, pretending not to eavesdrop. "Femi," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not going back, not yet." His jaw tightened, and he gestured around the shop. "This isn't your life. You belong in the city, with us. Do you think hiding out here changes anything?" Later that evening, I sat by the window in my small room, staring out at the quiet village streets. Femi's arrival had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. His words echoed in my mind. "This isn't your life." Was he right? Could I truly make a life here, or was I fooling myself? My thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, I found Tunde standing there, his expression unreadable. "I heard your brother came to the shop," he said simply. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You're thinking about leaving," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Femi thinks I'm running away, that I'm wasting my time here. Maybe he's right." Tunde's gaze softened, and he shook his head. "If you're running, it's not from this place, it's from whatever is holding you back out there." His words struck a chord deep within me, and for the first time that day, I felt the knot in my chest begin to loosen. "Why do you care?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Tunde hesitated, then said quietly, "Because I've seen what this place does. It gives people a chance to heal, to grow. It gave me that chance. And I think it's doing the same for you." Femi left the next morning, his disappointment hanging heavy in the air. "Don't stay here too long," he said before stepping into the waiting car. "You'll regret it." I didn't respond, and as the car disappeared down the dusty road, I felt an odd mix of relief and guilt. That afternoon, I found myself at the riverbank, watching the water rush by. Tunde arrived not long after, carrying a fishing net. He didn't say anything, simply sat beside me, the quiet between us as steady as the flowing river. After a long moment, he spoke. "You don't have to decide everything now," he said, his voice calm. "The answers will come when you're ready." I looked at him, his face lined with quiet wisdom, and felt a flicker of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. Together we sat by the river until the sun dipped below the horizon, and for now, that was enough. The weeks after Femi's visit were a blur of quiet reflection and hard work. Life in Ilera continued as usual, but something had shifted inside me. Femi's words lingered like a shadow, his warnings stirring doubts I couldn't shake. I tried to throw myself into the rhythm of the village, but my thoughts often drifted to the life I'd left behind. The expectations, the family name, and the privileges that came with it. The very things I had run from now loomed in my mind like a tether I couldn't fully escape. Tunde seemed to sense my unease. He began keeping his distance, showing up at the shop less frequently, and avoiding our usual encounters. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as days turned into weeks, his absence became undeniable. I felt his withdrawal like a loss I couldn't explain. Whenever I saw him working in the fields or walking through the village, he would nod politely but say little. The warmth that had grown between us seemed to have vanished, and I couldn't figure out why. One afternoon, I decided to confront him. I found him near the elder's farm, repairing a broken fence. He didn't look up when I approached, his hands steady as he worked. "You've been avoiding me," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He paused for a moment, then resumed hammering. "I've been busy," he replied curtly. "Busy?" I repeated, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Is that all this is? You're just busy?" He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine. "What do you want me to say, Io?" he asked quietly. "That I see you struggling and don't know how to help? That I'm afraid of what will happen when you decide to leave?" His words hit me like a blow, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "I haven't decided anything," I said, my voice trembling, "but it feels like you've already made up your mind for me." Tunde sighed, his shoulders sagging as if under the weight of an invisible burden. "I'm trying to protect myself," he admitted, "because people like you don't stay in places like this, and I can't go through losing someone again." His confession left me stunned. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I could. The truth was, I didn't know what my future held. I had come to Ilera to escape, but I had never planned for what would come next. I stood there, torn between the urge to comfort him and the sting of his words. "I thought you believed in this place," I said softly. "You told me it gives people a chance to heal." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "It does," he said, "but only for those who choose to stay." With that, he turned back to his work, leaving me standing there with a hollow ache in my chest. The days that followed were quiet and tense. Tunde and I avoided each other, and I found myself retreating into my thoughts more often. Even Mama Bisi noticed the change. "You and Tunde are like the sun and rain," she said one evening as we closed up the shop. "You can't figure out if you want to shine together or drown each other." I smiled weakly at her words, but they stayed with me. She wasn't wrong. Tunde and I had formed a connection that felt as natural as breathing, but now it seemed fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. I missed the way he used to look at me, the quiet understanding we had shared, but I didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between us. One evening, as the sun set over the village, I sat by the riverbank, the same spot where Tunde and I had shared so many quiet moments. The water reflected the fiery colors of the sky, its gentle current whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. I wondered if Tunde was right, if I would leave, just as he feared, and if staying here would mean giving up the life I had always known. I thought about the city, the family I had left behind, and the weight of their expectations. But more than anything, I thought about Tunde, his quiet strength, and the way he had made Ilera feel like home. I didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let this rift between us grow any wider. Somehow, I had to find a way to make things right. The air in Ilera buzzed with excitement as preparations for the annual festival began. Colorful fabrics were hung along the narrow streets, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the tangy aroma of roasted peppers. Children ran through the village with painted faces, laughing as they played games. Even the elders seemed to carry a lighter step, their voices animated as they recounted past festivals to anyone who would listen. Despite the festive atmosphere, my heart felt heavy. The tension between Tunde and me lingered, unresolved. I had considered seeking him out to talk, but every time I tried, doubt crept in. Did I even have the right to ask for his forgiveness when I wasn't sure of my own path? Mama Bisi, noticing my reluctance, handed me a basket of yam fritters. "Take these to the main square," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll feel better when you're part of the celebration." The main square was a riot of colors and sounds. Women danced to the beat of talking drums, their steps synchronized with the rhythm of the music. Men showcased their strength in a wrestling match, their laughter and cheers echoing through the crowd. I felt a flicker of warmth as I watched, a small piece of joy seeping into the cracks of my uncertainty. Then I saw Tunde, standing near the wrestling ring, his arms crossed as he watched the match. He hadn't seen me yet, but my pulse quickened all the same. I hesitated, then forced myself to approach him. "Tunde," I called softly, my voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. He turned, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Io," he said, his voice steady. For a moment, we stood in silence, the chaos of the festival swirling around us. Finally, I found the courage to speak. "Can we talk? Somewhere quieter?" He nodded, and we walked toward the edge of the square, where the noise faded into the background. I wrung my hands, searching for the right words. "I'm sorry," I said finally, "for how things have been between us. I've been unsure of myself, of everything, and I didn't mean to hurt you." Tunde studied me for a moment, his gaze unreadable. "I've been unfair too," he admitted. "I let my fears get in the way. It's easier to push people away than to risk losing them." His honesty caught me off guard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight between us begin to lift. "I don't want to be pushed away," I said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to lose what we have." The drums from the square grew louder, signaling the start of the storytelling. Tunde glanced toward the crowd, then back at me. "Come," he said, holding out his hand. "Let's join them." I hesitated, then placed my hand in his. The simple gesture sent a warmth through me, and we walked back to the square together. Under the towering baobab tree, the villagers gathered to listen to the tales passed down through generations. The elder storyteller, his voice deep and commanding, began a story about a hunter who braved the wilderness to find a rare flower for the one he loved. The hunter faced trials and temptations, but remained true to his heart, and in the end, he found the flower and returned home. As the elder spoke, I felt Tunde's hand brush against mine, a quiet but deliberate connection. When the story ended, the crowd erupted in applause and the music resumed. Tunde turned to me, his eyes soft. "You'll figure it out, Ayo," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "And when you do, I'll be here." His words stayed with me long after the festival ended, a steady light guiding me through the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The morning after the festival, the village was quiet, as though it were still resting from the night's festivities. I sat on the small bench outside Mama Eka's house, sipping tea and watching the sunrise. The warmth of Tunde's words lingered in my heart. "You'll figure it out, Ayo, and when you do, I'll be here." His faith in me had lit a spark of courage, but it also brought a deeper truth to the surface, one I could no longer ignore. I had hidden my identity for so long, fearing judgment, rejection, and the weight of expectations. But here in Ilera, I had found something real, people who saw me for who I was, not what my name represented. I knew I couldn't move forward with Tunde or anyone else without being honest about where I'd come from. If I wanted this life to be truly mine, I had to risk everything and tell Tunde the truth. That afternoon, I found him at the riverbank, casting a fishing net into the water. The sight of him, steady, calm, and unbothered by the world, gave me both comfort and fear. "Tunde," I called, my voice trembling slightly. He turned, a smile playing on his lips. "You're becoming a regular here," he teased. His lightheartedness made me hesitate, but I took a deep breath and sat down beside him. "I need to tell you something," I began, my hands twisting in my lap. He stilled, his focus shifting entirely to me. "I haven't been completely honest with you, or anyone here." His brow furrowed slightly, but he waited patiently for me to continue. "I came to Ilera because I needed to escape, but not just from city life. My name isn't just Ayo. I'm Ayo Ade, Chief Ade's daughter." Tunde blinked, clearly processing my words. "The chief aide?" he asked, his tone even but laced with disbelief. I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of shame settle on my shoulders. I ran away from a life of privilege, from expectations that didn't feel like mine. I didn't want to be the perfect daughter or the future wife of some man chosen by my father. I wanted to find out who I was without all of that. Tunde was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flowing river. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "Didn't you trust me?" His question stung, but I knew he deserved the truth. "It wasn't about trust," I said softly. "I was afraid. Afraid that if people knew, they'd treat me differently. That I'd never escape the weight of my family's name." Tunde nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I can understand that," he said, "but it doesn't change what's real here." His words surprised me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "You don't hate me?" I asked, my voice breaking. He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "No, Ayo, I don't hate you. But I wish you'd trusted me sooner. Trust is important to me." The honesty in his tone made my chest ache, but it was a relief to hear that he wasn't rejecting me outright. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to deceive you. I just needed to figure out who I was, without all the noise of my old life." He looked at me then, his gaze steady and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You're still Io," he said quietly, "the woman who works hard at Mama Bisi's shop, who sits by the river and listens to the world. That's who I see." His words broke something inside me, and I felt the weight of months of guilt lift from my shoulders. We sat there in silence, the river rushing by as the sun dipped lower in the sky. For the first time, I felt truly free, not just from the expectations of my family, but from the secrets I had carried for so long. The rains came again, but this time they didn't stop. What began as a steady drizzle turned into a relentless downpour that lasted for days. The river, usually calm and steady, began to swell, its waters rushing with dangerous speed. By the third day, the mood in the village shifted from unease to outright alarm. The elders called a meeting in the main square, their voices heavy with urgency. I stood near the back of the crowd, listening as they explained the situation. "The riverbanks are eroding," one elder said, his voice grave. "If this continues, the lower farms and some of the homes closest to the river could be washed away." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of fear. "We must act now," another elder added. "We need to fortify the banks and move supplies to higher ground." Volunteers quickly stepped forward, offering to help with the effort. I glanced around the square and saw Tunde standing near the front, already speaking with the elders about what needed to be done. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the panic around him, and I felt a surge of admiration for his quiet leadership. Without hesitation, I stepped forward. "I want to help too," I said, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling in my chest. The next few days were a blur of activity. The villagers worked tirelessly to secure the riverbanks, piling sandbags and reinforcing weak spots with rocks and logs. I joined the women in carrying supplies to higher ground, my arms aching with the effort, but my determination unwavering. Tunde was everywhere, directing volunteers, hauling heavy loads, and checking on the elders. His presence was a steadying force, and the villagers seemed to rally around him. On the fourth day, disaster struck. A section of the riverbank collapsed, sending water rushing toward the lower farms. Cries of alarm filled the air as villagers scrambled to save what they could. Tunde was at the forefront, wading into the rising water to salvage tools and crops. Without thinking, I followed him, my heart pounding as the cold water soaked through my clothes. "Io, what are you doing?" Tunde shouted over the roar of the river. "Get back!" But I shook my head, grabbing a basket of yams and turning toward the shore. The current was stronger than I expected, and my footing slipped on the muddy ground. For a terrifying moment, I thought I would be swept away, but Tunde's hand shot out, gripping my arm and pulling me upright. "Are you crazy?" he demanded, his voice harsh with worry. I could only nod, my breath coming in short gasps as he steadied me. Together, we made it back to dry land, where other villagers were waiting to take the salvaged supplies. Tunde turned to me, his expression a mixture of frustration and something deeper. "Don't ever do that again," he said quietly, his grip on my arm lingering for a moment before he let go. By the time the rains finally stopped, the damage had been contained. The riverbanks held, and most of the lower farms were spared, though the fields closest to the water were badly flooded. Exhausted but relieved, the villagers gathered to assess what had been lost and what could be salvaged. Despite the hardship, there was a sense of pride in what we had accomplished together. That evening, I sat by the river with Tunde, the memory of the day's chaos still fresh in my mind. The water had receded, but it flowed swiftly, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. "You scared me today," Tunde said, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced at him, surprised by the raw emotion in his tone. "I thought I was going to lose you." I didn't know what to say at first, so I simply reached out and placed my hand over his. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing," I said softly. "This place has given me so much. I had to help." Tunde's hand tightened around mine, and for a long moment we sat in silence, the bond between us stronger than ever. Whatever doubts or fears had lingered between us seemed to fade, replaced by an unspoken understanding that we were in this together. The village was slowly returning to normal, though signs of the recent storm remained. Flooded fields lay bare, their crops ruined, and some homes by the river still bore water stains, as a reminder of the crisis. Yet, amidst the recovery efforts, There was a renewed sense of unity in Ilera. The villagers worked together with determination, their resilience a testament to the strength of their community. For me, the storm had washed away more than just the mud and debris. It had stripped away my lingering doubts, leaving behind a clarity I hadn't felt before. I had found something here, something real, something I wasn't sure I could leave behind. But the shadow of my old life loomed larger than ever. Another letter had arrived from my father, its words sharper than before. "Come home now, or don't bother coming back at all." I sat with the letter in my lap, the weight of its ultimatum pressing down on me. Returning to the city meant stepping back into the life I had run from, a life of wealth, expectations, and family obligations. Staying in Ilera meant turning my back on that life for good, risking my family's wrath but holding on to the freedom and love I had found here. I thought of Tunde, his steady presence grounding me in ways I hadn't known I needed. Could I leave him behind? Could I ask him to leave with me? I found Tunde in the fields that evening, inspecting the newly planted cassava shoots. He glanced up as I approached, his face softening into a smile. "You're quiet today," he said, brushing the dirt from his hands. I hesitated, unsure of how to begin, but the words tumbled out anyway. "My father wants me to go back to the city," I said. "He's demanding it." Tunde's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. He leaned against his hoe, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And what do you want, Ayo?" he asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. I had been so consumed by what my father wanted, what the villagers expected, and what Tunde might need that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what I truly wanted. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I came here to find myself, but now I feel torn between two worlds. If I leave, I might lose this. If I stay, I might lose my family forever." Tunde nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to choose right now," he said. "But whatever you decide, make sure it's for you, not for anyone else." The next day, I spent hours walking the village, absorbing the sights and sounds that had become so familiar. The laughter of children playing in the square, the hum of women grinding spices, the rhythmic pounding of a drum in the distance, it all felt like home. But as I passed by Mama Bisi's shop, I imagined the towering skyscrapers of the city, the clinking glasses at dinner parties, and the weight of my family's expectations. I felt the familiar ache of longing and fear. That evening, I returned to the riverbank where Tunde was waiting. "I need to tell you something," I said, my heart pounding. He turned to me, his expression open but cautious. "If I go back to the city, I don't think I can come back to Ilera," I admitted. "My family won't allow it. And if I stay here, I might lose them forever." Tunde's face tightened, but he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I won't hold you back, Ayo. You deserve to find your place, wherever that is." His words were kind, but I saw the pain in his eyes. He was giving me the freedom to choose, even if it meant losing me. My throat tightened, and I fought back tears. "What if my place is here?" I asked softly. "With you?" Tunde's gaze softened, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. "Then I'll be here," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for as long as you want me to be." That night, I sat by the window of my small room, staring out at the stars. The weight of the decision still hung heavy, but for the first time I felt a quiet certainty beginning to bloom. My heart had already made its choice. Now, I just had to find the courage to follow it. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming flowers. I stood outside my small room, the weight of my decision finally lifting as I took one last look around. My bags were packed, not with the polished shoes and tailored dresses of my old life, but with the simple clothes and memories I had gathered here in Ilera. I wasn't leaving, I was choosing to stay. I walked through the village, the sun rising behind me and casting golden light on the homes and fields I had come to love. Children waved as I passed, their laughter filling the air. Mama Bisi stood at the shop, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw me, she smiled knowingly. "You look like a woman who's made up her mind," she said. I nodded, feeling the warmth of her approval. "I have," I replied. "Thank you for everything, Mama Bisi. You've given me more than you know." Her expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze my hand. "You've earned your place here, Ayo. You've found your roots." The words stayed with me as I made my way to the riverbank, where I knew Tunde would be. He was there, as always, his figure outlined by the shimmering water. The sight of him, steady, strong, and unwavering, made my heart swell with gratitude and love. He looked up as I approached, his eyes searching mine. "You've decided," he said, his voice calm but expectant. "I have," I said, stepping closer. "I'm staying. This is where I want to be." Tunde's expression flickered with relief, his shoulders relaxing as though a great weight had been lifted. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "This isn't an easy choice." I nodded, my voice steady. "I don't want the life I left behind, Tunde. That world was full of expectations that didn't feel like mine. Here I've found something real, something I can't leave behind." I paused, my voice softening. "I've found you." For a moment Tunde said nothing, his gaze locked with mine. Then he stepped forward, his hand brushing against my cheek. "You're brave, Io," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Braver than you know." His touch sent warmth through me, and when his lips met mine, it felt like a promise, a beginning we had both earned. The days that followed were filled with quiet joy. I wrote to my family, telling them of my decision and expressing my love for them, though I knew it might take time for them to understand. To my surprise, my mother replied with a short but heartfelt note. "We may not understand your choice, but we will always love you." Life in Ilera wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. I worked alongside Tunde in the fields, helped Mama Bisi in the shop, and found myself becoming part of the village in ways I hadn't imagined. Tunde and I grew closer with each passing day, our bond deepening as we shared both the challenges and the beauty of our simple life. One evening, as the sun set over the village, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Tunde and I stood by the riverbank. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked, his voice soft. I smiled, my heart full. "All the time," I said, "and for the first time, it doesn't scare me." He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Whatever it holds, we'll face it together," he said. I leaned against him, watching the water reflect the colors of the horizon. Ilera had become more than just a place of refuge, it had become my home. And as I stood there, wrapped in the warmth of Tunde's love and the strength of my own choices, I knew I had found what I had been searching for all along. Thank you for joining Io's journey of love and self-discovery in the beautiful village of Ilera. What would you choose? Love or the life you know? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel Tire World for more inspiring African folk tales. Until next time, keep believing in the power of choice and love.